Hey, welcome back to Mobility WOD. Today I want to lay out for you a concept, kind of a construct of how I think about complex movement, how I think about making movement problems visible, and it's kind of the first layer of order of movement that allows me to get athletes back after an injury or after a tweak or something or surgery. So this is called what I call the movement hierarchy. Okay, so movement hierarchy. Uh-oh, a little wet still. Okay, so here's how we want to think about it. We think about kind of three options. One is that we need to make movement complex. So this is a way that I can go from simple movement to more complex movement, sort of a scale of increasing motor control, the demands on the athlete. I can also make sort of movement problems more visible, which means that as I get more complex, hiding my range of motion dysfunctions or kind of tissue dysfunctions is a little bit more difficult. And finally, this is a model for rehab, is that when I have an injury or a problem. So here's how I start. And I've talked about a little bit this about before, but this is how we're going to go. We go from a position of high stability, to another position of high stability. Now, what this means, and also I'm going to add connection. And what this means is that I grind from a similar shape into another position with another similar shape and back up. And the whole time I'm staying connected, which looks like a back squat or an air squat, which is where we start with beginners. Unloaded, basic shapes and positions where we teach them to create torque, we have them go back down, come back up, create torque. This would be the basic power lifts, for example, going from a high shape back into a high shape with connection. The next thing that we do is we often do the same thing. We go from a position of high stability with no connection. So I remove the connection, and then I end up with a position of high stability again. And what happens in this situation is that by suddenly starting with the same shape but having to drop and create that sudden kind of high torque, high organized position without sort of lots and lots of grinding through range connection, suddenly I can start to make things a lot more manifest or a lot more clear. The example is taking the shoulder and doing something that looks like push jerk, where all of a sudden I've theoretically lost some of that connection through range, and all of a sudden when guys who can push press and even strict press, okay, they become lost as soon as I remove that connection. I have to stabilize from both sides of the joint at once. In CrossFit language, this is what we do this wall ball, where we basically take an athlete, have them throw, and have to receive a ball and land in that spontaneous position, same shape. Can they show me that same good squatting position in the bottom? You can see that there are a lot of motions that we do like this, where suddenly we're just asking the athlete a jumping lunge, for example, that can I maintain my same shape? So box jump is a good example. A lot of Carl Pauli's work is, can I jump in the air? Can I spontaneously create connection? That's why we've got to get our athletes jumping and landing effectively. All right, so removing the connection suddenly starts to make this a little bit more complex, and it starts to make kind of the problems of the athlete become more clear. When we get into real interesting issues is when I go from a position of transition or transitional position, which means that I'm starting in one shape and finishing in another shape. I go position of transition, no connection, into another position of high stability. What this looks like suddenly is that I have to take the shoulder and go from one shape, i.e. pulling, and spontaneously go into another shape. That I have to open the hip up and then spontaneously close the hip into the bottom of the receiving position. So you can suddenly see now, this is why things like all the Olympic lifts have to be part of our language of teaching athletes, because it makes it so clear the kind of problems that we end up having. It just pulls us all out. In terms of movement complexity, I have this schema now of the way I start with beginners, and if you think about the way you train most beginner athletes, there are all these basic shapes. We start to remove some of the connections. before we start to change transitional connections. In our gym, for example, this looks like an air squat. This looks like a wall ball. And then for beginners, the first positional transition that we teach is the burpee. People don't think about why it's so complex, but having to go from that open hip, jumping up and landing spontaneously, showing me a good landing position where I can achieve good foot position, good knee position, back straight. This is really, really difficult. And this is why that burpee is so ugly. It's an ugly mess of destruction. This easy way also gives me a way of kind of starting to bring athletes back into the fold who've been injured or post-surgery. I started making sure I have basic shapes. I start to remove the connection, adding speed, and no connection, and then all of a sudden we make them kind of show these transitional positions. You can think about why, this is such a difficult movement, the snatch, because I have to go from two shapes spontaneously at both sides. The shoulder has to change shape and spontaneously organize, and the hip has to change shape and spontaneously organize, and that's why one of those movements becomes so difficult. Now take a look at this. We go carry this a little bit further. One of the ways now that we can overlay this, in terms of movement complexity, is by adding and kind of increasing the uprightness of the torso. So if I look at the demands of the torso demands, I can do this. First thing we start, and if I ask anyone to jump and land, they'll always jump and land in a back squat. This allows me to have the most vertical shin. It allows me to kind of tap into my hamstrings. People will always default to this position. But as soon as I make this into a more uprighted torso, we start going into something that looks like front squat, suddenly we see that we have a whole host of hip range of motion demands and ankle range of motion demands that become much more significant under load. This is why we've got to teach our athletes to be upright, because this is much more difficult shape than leaning forward. If I'm going to jump a basketball, I'll always lean forward, but rebounding or jumping at the net with vertical torso causes all kinds of problems. A lot of the uprightness that we do is the reason we have to change directions and shape and be able to cut with this upright torso means we better train with that. As soon as I absolutely make sure that the torso is upright and the shoulder is overhead, then I start heading overhead squats. And now, with the demand of locking out a weight overhead, I force that I can't compensate a little bit or get away with some of the upper body bad mechanics that I see in the front squat. And no wonder suddenly we start to see massive, massive hip range of motion problems and massive ankle range of motion problems when I start adding the complexity of the overhead squat. You can see suddenly now that something like this becomes, no wonder it's starting to get interesting. Back squat, front squat, overhead squat. But this overhead squat is still going from a position of high stability, isn't it? Suddenly when you go snatch balance, these domains are still typically here, but snatch balance, I remove the connection, and no wonder then this becomes snatch. And look, back squat sort of is an A level exercise, front squat, B level, overhead squat, C level. When I start challenging this under the demand, you can see that this is D and sort of snatch ends up becoming an E in terms of difficulty of movement. So this is kind of the way I call this the movement hierarchy. It's the way I think about complexity of movement, looking at the different shapes and kind of stabilization kind of requirements of all these movements. By adding the upright torso, it gives me another mechanism to kind of go from position of high stability, no connection, and then to a transition position with no connection. More to come. See you tomorrow.